Hey Gecko fans, this is Wally Kern with Supreme Gecko. Are you a Crested Gecko expert? Well, let's see if you can find the three differences between this gecko, this is pumpkin seed, and this is another gecko we own. What are the three differences? Okay, so the first one's easy, and that's color. The second one is fairly easy too, I hope you realize, and that's size. What's the third one? It's age. These two geckos are very similar in age, both of them being over 16 months old. So you're asking at this point, how can this one be 16 months and this 16 months? I get this type of question all the time. This is from Janine, and she's asking, how big should my crested gecko be at 1 year old? It seems kind of small. Well, Janine, there's a reason for that. And I'm going to give you the three things that you can be doing for your baby crested geckos to make sure that they're the healthiest and they're the biggest crested geckos you can have at 1 year of age. Stay tuned. When we do reptile shows, we're approached all the time. People look at our crested geckos and they go, oh my gosh, it's so big. How old is it? And I'll tell them an adult crested gecko that we have on the table is about a year to 16 months of age, and they'll just be so surprised. It's crazy. They'll say, my crested gecko that's a year old is half that size. We're going to talk about three different things that you can do for your crested gecko babies, and I'll go ahead and do this in reverse order. The number 3 reason is if you have more than one crested gecko baby in an enclosure, you need to separate them after about a month, month and a half of age. When you have more than one crested gecko in an enclosure, you could encounter some problems. The first encounter that you can have is a food domination, and you're not going to see this whatsoever. If you have 2 crested geckos in the same enclosure, you could have one bullying the other crested gecko. You'll never, ever see that. Whenever we get a hatch, we get 2 babies. Female crested geckos lay 2 eggs at a time. When they hatch, we put the 2 babies in one enclosure. We grow them up for about a month and a half, and then we separate those 2 babies. During the first month and a half, it doesn't seem like there's any issues whatsoever, but after that point, we do see issues. And the first issue is that one will start growing a little quicker than the other. And the reason for that is the bigger one will dominate the second one and push it to the side. That second crested gecko, the smaller one, will always be subdominant to that dominant animal. The second reason we separate those 2 crested geckos is because there's a possibility that you could lose a tail with one of the crested geckos. How does that happen, you might ask? Well, one of the crested geckos might consider the tail of the other one to be food. I see it time and time again where one crested gecko will grab the tail of the other crested gecko and not let go until the second crested gecko jumps out of its way. We like tails on our crested geckos, and we just don't want to see crested geckos lose their tail unnecessarily. Now, the third reason you want to separate those 2 crested gecko babies out, and this is a little debatable, is to give both crested geckos more room. Now, if you're keeping your crested gecko babies in something as big as a 10-gallon enclosure, you might not have this issue whatsoever. But if you're keeping them in a 6 to a 19 quart, it might be an issue. I don't know. I haven't seen studies done on this. My feeling is the bigger enclosure for smaller animals like this, the better. They'll find the food, which is a major concern by a lot of crested gecko breeders. But I also feel that 2 crested geckos in a small enclosure might hamper the growth of those 2 crested geckos. So we start separating them out again after a month and a half. The second important thing that you need to do for your crested gecko babies to continue their health and to maintain that growth level is to provide heat. We're going to do this in the traditional who, what, when, where, and why questions, and I'm going to answer each one now. So the first one is who. Who should get heat? Well, that's any crested gecko baby. I provide heat for all of my crested geckos all the way up to adult size. What? Well, we're talking about heat. Heat means anything over 75. 75 to 80 degrees is perfect for these crested geckos. It maintains their metabolism. It actually stimulates their metabolism, and that makes them grow healthier and bigger. When? Well, we just talked about that right from birth all the way through subadult to adulthood. Where? Well, it really depends on your enclosure type. We provide tubs, 6 quart and 19 quart for our grow out animals. 6 quarts, we provide a heat source at the back end. Same thing with our 19 quarts. We provide about 25%, 30% of the enclosure with some heat. If you're using an enclosure where you can provide heat from the top, that's even better because the Crested Geckos can actually self-regulate themselves. They can go up to the heat when they're cool and get away from the heat when they're too warm. Next is why. Why do we provide heat? Well, it's pretty simple. We want to stimulate their metabolism. We want them to continue eating at a good pace. A higher metabolism means more active geckos. More active geckos means that they're eating more and they're growing more. So what have we missed? Who, what, when, where, why, how? How do we provide heat? Well, this might be the most important question. We provide heat with a heat cable behind the enclosures for our tubs. Now that works out great for us because it just provides enough heat to maintain about 25 to 30% of that enclosure at about 75 to 80 degrees, depending on the season. If you're using a different type of enclosure, say a glass aquarium, you can provide a canister on top of that enclosure and provide an incandescent bulb that raises that temperature in the high area to around 75 to 80 degrees. So we've talked about 2 different ways that you can maintain the health and increase the growth rate of your Crested Gecko, from separating 2 babies out to providing more heat. Here's probably the most important way that you can maintain that health and get great growth rates, and that's provide the right food. So what does that mean, the right food? Well, right from birth, we start feeding our Crested Geckos a good Crested Gecko diet. We prefer and recommend the Pangea Crested Gecko diet far better than the other diets on the market, I feel, in my honest opinion. So from the time that they hatch out, we start feeding the Crested Gecko diet to these babies every other day without missing at all. We put that diet in on a Monday, we take it out on a Wednesday and put more diet in on that Wednesday. Another question we get all the time is, it doesn't seem like my Crested Gecko baby is eating its diet. How can I tell that it's eating? Well, the very first question that I send back to the owner is, how much food are you feeding? So how much food do you need to feed to a baby Crested Gecko? Realize that a Crested Gecko stomach is just about the size of their head. You don't need to feed more than the size of their head to these Crested Geckos. For babies about 1 to 2 months, feed about the size of your thumbnail. That's all that they really need, and that way you can tell if that diet is getting eaten or not. So again, back to our analogy, Monday we feed, Tuesday I'll go in with a mister and I'll mist that diet just a little bit to soften it up, to make sure that they get more diet if they want on Tuesday. And then again, Wednesday I pull that diet out and I put in a new dish of diet. I talked about Crested Gecko diet, but here's the most important thing. If you get one thing out of this presentation, I hope this is it. We feed a lot of bugs to our Crested Geckos. We let them eat Crested Gecko diet for about 2 weeks or so, and we start pounding them with insects. Just pound them. We feed at about 2 weeks old mealworms, but it has to be the right size. They're not going to take, obviously, an adult mealworm, but they can certainly take a mealworm the size of their head, the width of their head, plus a little tiny bit more. A huge mistake that a lot of keepers make is to feed too small of insects. Don't add a pinhead-sized cricket to your baby Crested Geckos. It's just not enough meal, and they're going to spend way more energy trying to catch that pinhead. Give them a good-sized cricket, again, about the size of their head, and they'll enjoy that. In fact, here's another huge tip. We don't even feed crickets to our baby Crested Geckos. We prefer mealworms because it wriggles right in front of them and it's something for them to easily get and eat. And we also feed dubias. When we feed dubias to our enclosures, baby Crested Gecko enclosures, we let them free run. That's because the bottoms of the enclosures are bare bottom and the Crested Geckos will see those dubias easier and just nail them. When those Crested Gecko babies are young, we'll feed live food at least once, sometimes twice a week, without missing a beat. I feel personally that this adds protein to their diet, which is super important for good growth rates. And of course, if you're feeding live foods, make sure you gut load them before you feed them to your insects. Make sure that those insects are eating carrots, something with a lot of nutritional value to pass right on to your crested geckos. So again, 3 very important things that you need to do to ensure the health and the good growth rates of your baby crested geckos. Separate those crested geckos. If you keep 2 in an enclosure, make sure that you're separating after about a month and a half. Provide heat. Make sure that you're keeping those crested geckos at around 75 to 80 degrees so that they maintain their metabolism, eat more, and grow quickly. And third, make sure you're giving an ample amount of food. Make sure that you're managing that food so that you know for sure that they're eating, but give live foods. Give them mealworms, give them dubias, and they'll grow like weeds. I hope this video helped you if you're struggling with the size of your crested gecko babies. If you like this video, go ahead and hit that thumbs up, like button, hit the subscriptions and notification all so you don't miss another one of these videos. Thank you, gecko fans, for watching.